You know, sometimes the universe has a funny way of putting people in their place. And what I'm about to tell you is one of those moments that will make you believe in destiny. Picture this. It's the late 1950s, Elvis Presley is already the biggest name in rock and roll. Women are fainting at his concerts, teenagers are going crazy over his music, and the older generation is calling him dangerous and vulgar. But there's something most people didn't know about Elvis back then, something that would become one of the most talked about moments in music history, and it all started with a joke that backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. Now, before I dive into this incredible story, I need you to do me a favor. If you love Elvis Presley, if you're fascinated by music history, or if you just enjoy stories about people defying expectations, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications because we're diving deep into the untold stories of the king of rock and roll. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss what happens next in this story. And if you stick around until the end, I'll reveal something about Elvis's piano playing that even his closest friends didn't know about until years later. So let me set the scene for you. Elvis is at this exclusive Hollywood party thrown by one of the big movie studios. He's been making films, and while the movies aren't exactly winning Oscars, they're making money hand over fist, and Elvis is now moving in circles with some of the biggest names in entertainment. The party is packed with actors, directors, producers, and musicians, the kind of event where everybody who's anybody wants to be seen. Now, in the corner of this massive Beverly Hills mansion, there's a gorgeous white grand piano, and standing next to it is this classically trained pianist, a man who had performed at Carnegie Hall, who had studied at the finest music conservatories in Europe, and who honestly looked down his nose at rock and roll music. This pianist, let's call him what he was, an elitist snob, had been making comments all evening about how rock and roll wasn't real music, how it was just noise for teenagers who didn't know any better, and how performers like Elvis were ruining the American musical landscape. You can imagine how that went over with some of the younger people at the party who absolutely loved Elvis. Now, Elvis, being Elvis, he was always humble and respectful, especially around people he didn't know well. He wasn't the type to start arguments or try to prove himself to people who didn't want to understand what he was doing. But this pianist, emboldened by a few too many cocktails and surrounded by people who were hanging on his every word, decided he was going to have some fun at Elvis's expense. He called out across the room, loud enough for everyone to hear, and said something along the lines of, "Well, Mr. Presley, I hear you're quite the musician. Why don't you come over here and show us what you can do on a real instrument?" The emphasis he put on the words "real instrument" was dripping with condescension. The room got quiet. You could feel the tension building because everyone knew this was a setup, a joke designed to embarrass Elvis in front of Hollywood's elite. The pianist was assuming, like so many people did back then, that Elvis was just a pretty face who gyrated his hips and could barely play guitar, let alone tackle something as sophisticated as a piano. But here's where the story gets interesting, and this is what most people don't know about Elvis Presley. See, before Elvis was the king of rock and roll, before the gold records and the sold-out concerts and the Hollywood movies, he was just a poor kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, and later Memphis, Tennessee, who absolutely loved music. And I'm not just talking about rock and roll or gospel or blues, I'm talking about all music. Elvis's mother, Gladys, had scraped together money when Elvis was just a boy to get him access to a piano, and he spent hours teaching himself to play. He couldn't afford formal lessons like this classically trained pianist at the party, but Elvis had something that no music conservatory could teach. He had soul, he had feeling, and he had an innate understanding of music that came from somewhere deep inside him. By the time he was a teenager, Elvis could play piano well enough to accompany himself on gospel songs at church, and he had developed his own style that blended everything he'd absorbed from the black gospel churches he'd visited, the country music he'd heard on the radio, and the blues that poured out of the clubs on Beale Street in Memphis. So when this famous pianist challenged him at that party, Elvis didn't get defensive. He didn't make excuses or try to back out of the situation. According to people who were there that night, Elvis just smiled that famous smile of his, the one that could charm anyone, and he said something like, "Well, sir, I'll give it a try, but I'm not sure I can play the kind of music you're used to." The pianist laughed, thinking he'd already won this little game he'd started, and he gestured grandly toward the piano bench, inviting Elvis to sit down. The crowd gathered around, some people looking excited to see what would happen, others looking uncomfortable because they could sense this was meant to be a humiliation. And Elvis, dressed in one of his flashy outfits that the older generation loved to criticize, walked over to that white grand piano and sat down on the bench. He stretched his fingers for a moment, looking at the keys the way someone might look at an old friend they haven't seen in a while, and then he started to play. Now, I want you to imagine what happened next, because this is where the story becomes legendary. Elvis didn't play some simple rock and roll tune or a watered-down version of one of his hits. No, Elvis started playing gospel music, but not just any gospel music. He launched into a medley that started with "How Great Thou Art," one of the most powerful hymns ever written, and his fingers flew across those keys with the kind of technical skill that made the famous pianist's jaw literally drop. But it wasn't just technical skill, and this is crucial to understand. Elvis played with such raw emotion, such genuine feeling, that people in that room started getting chills. Women who had been sipping champagne and gossiping about movie stars suddenly had tears rolling down their cheeks. Men who had been talking business deals fell completely silent. And Elvis, with his eyes closed, swaying slightly as he played, was completely lost in the music. He transitioned seamlessly from gospel into blues, playing riffs that would have made Memphis piano masters proud, and then he shifted into boogie-woogie, his left hand pounding out a bass line that had people's feet tapping despite themselves. The famous pianist, the one who had made the joke, the one who had challenged Elvis thinking he was going to embarrass him, stood there with his mouth open, completely stunned. Because what he was witnessing wasn't just competent piano playing, it was artistry. It was the real deal. Elvis was showing everyone in that room that his talent went far deeper than his hit records, far beyond his good looks and his controversial dance moves. He was proving that he was a true musician, someone who understood music at its core. Someone who could take a piano and make it sing in ways that touched people's souls. And the kicker? Elvis never bragged about his piano skills. He never went around telling people he could play. He let his guitar and his voice do the talking, and the piano was something he played for himself, for his own enjoyment, in private moments. But when pushed into a corner, when challenged by someone who assumed he was nothing more than a talentless pretty boy, Elvis showed exactly what he was made of. The performance lasted about 15 minutes, though people who were there said it felt both longer and shorter at the same time, the way powerful experiences can distort your sense of time. When Elvis finally hit the last note and lifted his hands from the keys, there was a moment of complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then the room erupted in applause. People were cheering, whistling, and several well-known musicians who were at the party rushed over to shake Elvis's hand and tell him how incredible that was. The famous pianist, the one who started this whole thing as a joke, had to walk over and publicly apologize. According to witnesses, he shook Elvis's hand and admitted that he had completely misjudged him, that he had never heard anyone play with such feeling and technical skill combined. Elvis, being the gracious person he was, just smiled and said something humble like, "I just love music, sir. All kinds of music. We're all just trying to express ourselves the best way we know how." But here's where the story gets even better, and this is something I really want you to pay attention to because it tells you everything you need to know about Elvis Presley's character. After that party, the famous pianist actually became one of Elvis's defenders in the classical music community. He started telling people that Elvis was a legitimate musician, that rock and roll might not be his personal taste, but that Elvis Presley had real talent and understood music theory and composition in ways that most people didn't give him credit for. The pianist even went on record in a couple of interviews saying that if Elvis had wanted to pursue classical piano instead of rock and roll, he could have had a successful career as a concert pianist. Now, think about that for a moment. Here was someone who had tried to embarrass Elvis, who had looked down on him and his music, and Elvis's response wasn't to gloat or make the guy feel worse. His response was to play from his heart and let the music speak for itself, and in doing so, he won over one of his harshest critics. This story spread through Hollywood like wildfire, and it changed how a lot of people viewed Elvis. Suddenly, musicians and producers who had dismissed him as just another teen idol started taking him more seriously. They started realizing that Elvis wasn't manufactured by some record company, that his talent was real and multifaceted, and that there was much more depth to him than what you saw on stage or on television. And here's something fascinating: after this incident, Elvis started incorporating more piano into his recording sessions and live performances. If you go back and listen to some of his later gospel albums, especially How Great Thou Art, which won him his first Grammy Award, you can hear Elvis on piano in several tracks, and the emotion he brings to those recordings is just extraordinary. That Grammy, by the way, was for Best Sacred Performance, and it was one of the few times that the mainstream music establishment really acknowledged Elvis's artistry beyond his commercial success as a rock and roll star. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. You might be wondering if this story is even true, if it's been exaggerated over the years, or if it's one of those Hollywood legends that gets better with each retelling. And that's a fair question to ask. But here's the thing: multiple people who were at that party have confirmed the basic facts of this story over the years. Musicians who were there, actors who witnessed it, even the pianist himself mentioned it in an interview before he died, though he was clearly embarrassed about his role in the whole thing. And if you know anything about Elvis's life, if you've studied his background and his relationship with music, this story makes perfect sense. Elvis was never the kind of person to show off or prove himself to people unless he was pushed into a corner. He was humble about his talents, almost to a fault. His mother had raised him to be respectful and polite, especially to his elders, and Elvis carried that with him his entire life. But when someone challenged him directly, when someone tried to diminish his artistry or suggest that he wasn't a real musician, that's when you'd see glimpses of what Elvis was really capable of. And this piano incident at that Hollywood party was one of those moments. It revealed not just his skill as a musician, but his character as a person. He could have responded with anger or arrogance. He could have refused to play and walked away from the situation. But instead, he sat down at that piano and poured his heart out, and in doing so, He taught everyone in that room a lesson about judging people based on assumptions and stereotypes. The famous pianist learned that lesson the hard way, and to his credit, he owned up to his mistake and became an advocate for Elvis's musical legitimacy. That takes humility, and it shows that good music has the power to change minds and bridge divides between different worlds and different generations. This incident also highlights something really important about the 1950s and early 1960s music scene that people today might not fully appreciate. There was a huge cultural divide between the classical music establishment and the emerging rock and roll movement. Classical musicians and critics saw rock and roll as crude, simplistic, and even dangerous. They thought it was corrupting young people and destroying musical standards. Meanwhile, rock and roll artists and their fans saw classical music as stuffy, elitist, and out of touch with real life and real emotions. Elvis existed right in the middle of that divide. He loved gospel music, which had classical elements to it in terms of harmony and structure. He loved blues and country, which were dismissed by the establishment as primitive. And he created rock and roll by blending all these influences together in a way that was revolutionary. So when that famous pianist challenged him, it wasn't just about one person trying to embarrass another. It was symbolic of a larger cultural conflict, and Elvis's response, playing with both technical skill and deep emotion, was his way of showing that these artificial divisions between different types of music were meaningless. Good music is good music, whether it comes from a concert hall or a Memphis recording studio. After word got out about this piano performance, other musicians started sharing their own stories about Elvis's abilities. There were stories about recording sessions where Elvis would sit at the piano and work out harmonies for his backup singers. Stories about late-night jam sessions where Elvis would play piano for hours, working through old gospel songs and blues numbers. Stories about how he could hear a song once and then sit down and play it by ear, adding his own embellishments and style to it. Charlie Hodge, who was part of Elvis's inner circle for years, talked about how Elvis would sometimes spend entire evenings at Graceland just playing piano and singing, not for an audience, not for a recording, but just for the pure joy of making music. These weren't public performances, these were private moments, and they showed that for Elvis, music wasn't just a career or a way to make money. It was fundamental to who he was as a person. It was how he processed emotions, how he connected with his spirituality, how he made sense of the world around him. And here's something that might surprise you: Elvis actually could read music, though he didn't rely on it heavily. He learned to read music as a kid, picking it up from church and from friends who played instruments. But he preferred to play by ear because it felt more natural and spontaneous to him. This is important because there's a myth that Elvis couldn't read music and was somehow musically illiterate, but that's completely false. He could read music when he needed to, but he chose not to depend on it because his ear was so good and his instincts were so strong. Many of the greatest jazz and blues musicians worked the same way, and it didn't make them any less legitimate as artists. In fact, it often made their music more immediate and emotionally direct because they weren't thinking about notes on a page, they were feeling the music in the moment and responding to it instinctively. The Hollywood party incident became one of those defining moments that people would talk about for years afterward. It joined the list of stories that demonstrated Elvis's character and talent beyond his public persona. And for the famous pianist who started the whole thing as a joke, well, it became a cautionary tale about making assumptions based on someone's appearance or their genre of music. He learned that day that talent comes in many forms, that artistry isn't confined to concert halls and conservatories, and that sometimes the person you underestimate is actually the one who has the most to teach you. It's a lesson that's still relevant today, in a world where people are quick to judge and dismiss things they don't understand or that don't fit their narrow definitions of what's acceptable or legitimate. Now, I want to bring this back to something personal for a moment, because I think this story resonates with a lot of us on a deeper level. How many times have you been underestimated? How many times has someone looked at you and made assumptions about what you can or can't do based on how you look, where you're from, or what they think they know about you? Elvis dealt with that his entire career. People assumed he was just a good-looking guy who got lucky. They assumed he didn't write his own songs, so he wasn't a real artist. They assumed he was vulgar and dangerous because of the way he moved on stage. They assumed he was stupid because he had a southern accent and came from poverty. And time again, Elvis proved those assumptions wrong, not by arguing or defending himself, but by simply being excellent at what he did. That piano performance at the Hollywood party was just one example of many where Elvis showed people they had judged him too quickly and too harshly. And here's what makes Elvis's story so enduring and so inspiring: he never became bitter about being underestimated. He never let the criticism and judgment turn him into someone angry or resentful. He just kept doing what he loved, kept making music, kept treating people with respect, and kept proving through his actions that he was so much more than the stereotypes people tried to force on him. That takes an incredible amount of inner strength and confidence. It takes maturity beyond your years. Elvis was in his early 20s when a lot of this was happening, but he handled it with more grace than people twice his age. And that's one of the reasons why his legacy has endured for decades after his death. It's not just about the music, though the music is incredible. It's about what he represented as a person, as an artist who refused to be limited by other people's narrow definitions and expectations. The piano story also reminds us that Elvis was constantly learning and growing as a musician. He never became complacent or satisfied with what he'd already achieved. He kept exploring different styles, different instruments, different ways of expressing himself. When he got interested in karate in the 1960s, he approached it with the same dedication he brought to music, eventually earning a black belt. When he became fascinated with spiritual and philosophical questions, he read voraciously and engaged in deep conversations with anyone who would discuss these topics with him. Elvis had a curious mind and a restless creative spirit, and the piano was just one outlet for that creativity. He also played some guitar, obviously, and he had a good sense of drums and percussion. He understood how all the pieces of a band fit together, which made him a great producer of his own music, even when he wasn't officially credited as such. If you go back and listen to Elvis's gospel recordings, especially the albums he made in the late 1960s and early 1970s, you can really hear his piano playing shine through. Songs like He Touched Me and I, John feature Elvis on piano, and the passion and skill he brings to those performances is undeniable. Those gospel albums meant more to Elvis than almost any of his other recordings. He won 3 Grammy Awards in his lifetime, and all 3 were for gospel music. That tells you where his heart really was. Rock and roll made him famous and made him rich, but gospel music fed his soul. And the piano was his instrument of choice for expressing that side of himself. There's something intimate and personal about the piano that suited Elvis's approach to gospel music. The guitar was for his rock and roll rebellion, but the piano was for his spiritual searching and his conversations with God. One more thing I want to mention about this story, and this is crucial. The famous pianist who challenged Elvis that night at the party went on to tell other classical musicians that they needed to pay attention to what was happening in popular music, that there was real artistry there that deserved respect and recognition. He became kind of a bridge between two musical worlds that had been at war with each other, and it all started because Elvis handled that confrontation with such class and skill. That's impact beyond just that one moment. That's changing culture and changing minds. And it happened because Elvis didn't stoop to the level of his challenger. He didn't try to embarrass the guy or show him up in a mean-spirited way. He just played music from his heart, and the truth of his talent was so undeniable that it transformed someone who had been his critic into someone who became his advocate. That's the power of genuine artistry. It transcends arguments and opinions and speaks directly to something deeper in all of us. So what can we learn from this incredible story about Elvis and the famous pianist? First, never underestimate someone based on stereotypes or assumptions. The person you're dismissing might surprise you in ways you never imagined. Second, when you're challenged or criticized, respond with excellence, not with anger or defensiveness. Let your work speak for itself. Third, stay humble and gracious even when you have every right to be proud or to put someone in their place. Elvis could have humiliated that pianist, but instead, he won him over and turned him into an ally. That's wisdom and maturity. Fourth, never stop learning and growing in your craft. Elvis could have coasted on his rock and roll success, but he kept developing as a musician, kept exploring new instruments and new styles, and that depth made him legendary. And fifth, remember that the greatest artists are the ones who can bridge divides and bring people together. Elvis's music brought together black and white audiences at a time when America was deeply segregated. His style brought together different musical traditions that had been kept separate. And his piano playing at that Hollywood party brought together the classical music establishment and the rock and roll revolution, at least for one night, and showed that they had more in common than anyone realized. Before I wrap this up, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated because of assumptions people made about you? How did you handle it? Did you prove them wrong the way Elvis did, or did you walk away from the situation? Drop your stories in the comments below because I love reading them and I know other viewers do too. We're building a community here of people who love Elvis Presley and appreciate the lessons his life can teach us, and your experiences are part of that conversation. And listen, if you enjoyed this story, if it moved you or inspired you or taught you something you didn't know before, please hit that like button. It helps this video reach more people who need to hear this message. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story I'm going to tell you about Elvis, because trust me, there are so many more incredible untold stories about the king of rock and roll that deserve to be shared with the world. You know, as I finish telling you this story about Elvis and that famous pianist, I can't help but think about how much we need more people like Elvis in the world today. People who respond to hate with love, to criticism with excellence, to assumptions with proof of their true character. People who stay humble even when they're the biggest star in the world, who treat everyone with respect regardless of whether they deserve it or not, and who use their talents to bring people together instead of driving them apart. Elvis wasn't perfect, no human being is, but in moments like that night at the Hollywood party, he showed us what's possible when you combine genuine talent with genuine character. He showed us that you don't have to tear other people down to lift yourself up, that you can win people over through the quality of your work and the content of your character, and that the best response to someone who doubts you is to simply be undeniably excellent at what you do. That piano sat in the corner of that Beverly Hills mansion, waiting for someone to play it, and when Elvis finally sat down and put his hands on those keys, he didn't just play music. He changed minds, touched hearts, and proved something that needed to be proven. He showed everyone in that room that talent and artistry aren't limited by genre or background or the prejudices of people who think they're better than everyone else. And the famous pianist who challenged him as a joke learned the most important lesson of his life that night. Never underestimate the kid from Memphis who grew up poor but grew up loving music with every fiber of his being, because that kid just might be the most talented person in the room, and he just might teach you something about humility and grace while he's at it. That's the legacy of Elvis Presley, and that's why we're still talking about him almost 50 years after his death. Because stories like this one remind us of what's possible when talent meets opportunity meets character, and they inspire us to be better than we were yesterday. So thank you for watching, thank you for being part of this community, and I'll see you in the next video where I'll share another incredible untold story about the king of rock and roll. Until then, keep the music alive, stay humble no matter how much success you achieve, and remember that the best way to handle your critics is to be so undeniably excellent that they have no choice but to become your biggest fans. Elvis understood that, and now you do too. Take care, and long live the king.